Welcome to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How we consume it and how it informs our everyday culture.
I'm Christian Sager, a writer and a designer.
And I'm Charlie Bennett, a librarian and a radio raconteur.
Each episode is us trying to understand the entertainment world that we all live in.
Just a little bit better.
Today's episode is about Chapo Trap House. This political comedy podcast makes over $1 million a year from its Patreon subscribers alone. So we try to unpack how it gets made while learning more about the personal values associated with the, quote, dirtbag left.
You can follow along with show notes at patreon.com/supercontext, where you can leave a comment or write us an email at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com. Are you a Chapo Trap House listener? Will you ever be?
Sometimes when I'm walking around, walking my dogs, usually at night or in the morning, I look around at the world and I think about the society that I live in and like the houses I'm walking by and the streets that I'm on, the cars that are driving by and the people doing everyday people things, going to school, going to work, living their lives in their homes, trying to earn a living. And I look at all of it and I think, is it possible that we live in some kind of dystopian past? That there's going to be a point in the future, if there is a future, Charlie, where human beings are going to look back on this period of time and think about us as sort of barbaric and savage and, oh, if only they had figured it out the way we had figured it out, the same way we think about, I don't know, the Wild West or the Romans, right? That all of this seems to be, I don't know, kind of messed up and not really working, and yet we just grind on through it.
I have a couple questions for you now.
Oh, okay, yeah.
My first question is, so you get that from like 9 square blocks of Portland?
I mean, I get it. Let's be honest. I'm a bit of a cynic. I get it pretty much every time I leave the house.
Yeah.
It's not just that. Yeah.
Yeah. And my other question, do you feel like there's any time that is not that? I mean, I feel like it's automatically a dystopian past if you look at the progress in some particular area, whatever history you're looking at. There was no perfect time. There was no Garden of Eden. There's no historical pinnacle. Right.
And the assumption here being that human progress is getting better incrementally.
I mean, certainly there's the Pinker argument. You know, everything is better than it used to be.
Yep.
And there's like tons of anecdotal evidence, like we're not wearing wool suits in the summertime. Right? And that is a clear step forward in civilization. But also, like, the things that are remarkable about ancient Greece could very well just be canceled out by the lack of hygiene and the savagery, you know? Like, that you could just do that.
Right, yeah, I mean, we're getting into real deep philosophical territory here. But yeah, I mean, like, that, like, the beauty of humanity's imagination and storytelling, does it outweigh the cost of our barbarity?
Right. And so that is the human condition. So what in particular is making you highlight it with today's society?
Well, because I listened to Chapo Trap House for the last week.
Did you say Chapo Trap House?
I mean, whatever. Go ahead and do your thing.
I listened to the host and he keeps saying Chapo.
Okay.
Chapo Trap House.
I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce it. I have heard everybody say El Chapo. That's El Chapo. Probably wrong. Okay. I don't know how he pronounces it when he's calling himself that. I couldn't find a pronouncer on YouTube.
Right. You're referring to the famous drug kingpin or cartel leader, right, Joaquin Guzman, right?
Yeah. And when I heard them say Chapo on the podcast, I assumed it was like an in-joke because they, as we will get into, have James Adomian and other comedians come on and
Right.
pretend to be people like Sebastian Gorka, who pronounce things in kind of silly ways, making fun of these political figures.
Yes.
So I think
done a
anything
little
goes
diversion.
today on the pronouncing.
I'm going to shoot for Chapo,
Okay.
and I am not going to say anything more about Chapo.
Okay.
Okay.
I like Chapo better because I like just the idea of like a guy just kind of walking around in a pair of chaps and nothing else.
Hey, I'm Chapo.
I'm
How you doing?
Chapo.
Yeah. Okay. So you've been listening to it.
Yeah. And we've got a lot to talk about today. This is a listener suggestion. It's also another podcast. We seem to be covering more and more podcasts lately. A lot of people have suggested that we do it. It seems like we're like unofficially turning into a podcast analysis show.
Well, there's only so many comedy albums that we can dig into, right?
But yeah, as I was listening to it, I was like, oh, this show is like the inner monologue I have when I'm walking around, just actually articulated.
Wow.
And it really both exacerbated that inner monologue, but also was comforting because I didn't feel alone.
It must be awful
To be
in
me?
your head.
Oh yeah, it's a garbage dump.
Okay. I want to complete the thought about the dystopian past as present,
Yeah.
right? I feel very sad and frustrated and scared a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that is a condition that I can recover from. I don't believe that that's the condition that I ought to be in.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's my take on it.
I would add, yeah, just because I think that the world and the way humans treat it is going pretty poorly doesn't mean that I think my place within it deserves happiness. But I am trying to balance my happiness with the cost of others.
Gotcha. Okay. So to return to what you were saying, this was a patron request suggestion from a while back, Roar Vinland, who said to us one time, would you guys consider doing an episode on the Chapo Trap House podcast or their book? And I'm going to quote Roar at length here. I would argue that their podcast has had some very noticeable effects on the culture, from being the most successful Patreon ever to inspiring countless left-wing podcasts in the wake of 2016, and being one of the voices in a new kind of resurgent American left. And Roar also thinks there is a very convincing argument that the reason for the podcast's success is because of the internet and podcasts' way of bypassing traditional mass media and its monolithic grasp on culture.
Wow, that's a lot.
It's
That's
a good
lot.
sell. I mean, it got me, yeah.
I will just say, to kick this off, outside of my just incredibly pessimistic worldview that I presented to all of you, the way that I heard about Chapo Trap House first was when we went to go set up our Patreon a year ago. Mm-hmm. And I started doing research, as I tend to do, into what Patreons are successful and what have they been doing. And I was like, holy shit, who are these people? They are making $1 million a year doing a podcast on their own. And so I knew what it was, but I hadn't listened to it until now.
Yeah, and it was in the air for me for a long time. I mean, long time, since 2016, probably early 2017.
Yeah.
When my the hypersensitivity came, at the beginning of the Trump.
You're the way that Charlie's
experience.
gesturing right now, everybody, as if the third eye in his forehead has just opened and is shining rays out upon the world.
I've been transformed into an enormous vermin, and my antennae are flitting.
All your
about.
chakras got lit up, man.
Yeah. So I'm not going to make a Kundalini joke, even though I ought to. I have been hearing about Chapo Trap House. It's been referred to pretty consistently by a lot of my Twitter interests. I'm not always the ones that I follow, not always my followers. It's just there's this Twitter-ness. There's this sort of Twitter discourse.
Yeah, that is something that I learned in the research, is that this show, as Roar points out, probably wouldn't exist without Twitter.
So let's talk about how Chapo Trap House is made, how it came to be, and how people receive it. And maybe try and do a little diagnosing of where we are when it comes to how Chapo Trap House is distributed and taken in, not a diagnosis of our political agreement and disagreement with the hosts.
I think there'll be a little bit of us talking about how we as listeners related to the show or didn't relate to the show, but I would like to try to keep our own politics as objective as possible in analyzing this and why it's successful.
Yeah, I think it would be a bad idea to try and argue.
We don't need to argue the merits of Marxism.
Yes. So Chapo Trap House is a political humor podcast, or a humorous political podcast, or it's a party podcast, man, with a bunch of folks who are serious American left as opposed to liberals.
Or sometimes it's just an interview show.
Occasionally, yeah. I don't think that's how it started, but yes.
I will throw this out.
Occasionally happens now.
I listened to 3 episodes in preparation for our recording today. And one of them was the Alan Moore interview. And it was...
Did you confirm for yourself that it was not James Adomian?
Yeah, it was actually Alan Moore. For a while there, I thought it was just James Adomian pretending to be Alan Moore, because he does that on his podcast. No, it was an actual interview with Alan Moore. And I will say this, it is hands down the best interview I've ever heard with him. The most insightful and most compelling. And the questions were really well thought out.
Which is very different from some of the episodes that I listened to.
Totally, yeah.
That sounded like a Skype conversation being recorded during a Skype conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like a bunch of bros in their apartment in Brooklyn talking about Bernie Sanders and making poop jokes.
Well, that is what it is, except for the apartment in Brooklyn. They're all over the place, I believe.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Let's now look to the way that some other people have described the podcast. Sam Reisman said, "The podcast is loosely organized around the hosts riffing, often hilariously," he says, "on recently published articles and columns, as well as generally issuing scattershot contempt for whatever crosses their radar." I feel like that really sums it up. That's like a perfect description of the central format of the podcast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in some ways, I think that could describe our podcast, Charlie. And so...
we try to avoid recently published articles and columns.
But I did notice that there were some similarities between this show and ours, and that might be part of why people felt some resonance and why it would be a good thing for us to cover.
Okay. If you've never heard the podcast, here are some examples from that Reisman piece about things that they have done. They accuse the hit musical Hamilton of feeding a, quote, limp dick liberal fantasy and being a tokenist paean to performative nerd culture. They say things like, "I would much sooner believe that Ted Cruz has sex with a pulsating sack of spider eggs than with a human woman." They made jokes about Antonin Scalia's death, about how it was actually a good thing for unions. Quote, "The ability of millions of Americans to collectively bargain came down to whether one fat old man decided to do some sit-ups or not." That's the level of, and their cartoonish threats are, one of the hosts says, "for entertainment purposes only." They are just kidding, man. Just kidding all the time.
Yeah. So I want to plant a flag right now to help ground us and the listeners, because I found the way that they use the words liberal and liberalism and neoliberalism was a little confusing to me at first.
And the left, right?
And the left, yeah. And so let's kind of orient ourselves before we get too far in this. So when they say, for instance, that Hamilton is a limp dick liberal fantasy, they're not saying that because they're Mike Pence criticizing Hamilton. They're even further to the left, or progressively, however you want to You want to place, your markers for that kind of a thing. So let's do some grounding here. And you could probably help me, Charlie, given your economics background. Neoliberalism is a modified form of liberalism that favors free market capitalism. This is what the Chapo hosts seem to mean when they talk about liberal or liberalism. They're talking about it from an economic point of view, not a socially political point of view.
There is that, but I would also refer us back to Phil Oakes' Love Me, I'm a Liberal.
I don't know this.
No, it's a song from, maybe the early 60s. It's essentially you think you're on the side of progress, but you're a liberal with a kind of limp dick version of what needs to be done. Like, here are the lyrics. The beginning of them. I cried when they shot Medgar Evers. Tears ran down my spine. I cried when they shot Mr. Kennedy, as though I'd lost a father of mine. But Malcolm X got what was coming. He got what he asked for this time. So love me, love me, love me. I'm a liberal. I go to civil rights rallies and I put down the old DAR. I love Harry and Sydney and Sammy. And, okay, this is the lyrics, everyone. I hope every colored boy becomes a star. But don't talk about revolution. That's going a little bit too far. So love me, love me, love me. I'm a liberal.
That sounds about right.
There's not a lot that's new about this distinction. This song was from 1966 is when it was first released on an album. But he had been singing it, in concert for at least a few years before.
So that totally lines up with my impression of their worldview. Then also liberalism, we just defined neoliberalism, right? And so most often I hear people refer to neoliberalism when they're talking about American politics and foreign policy, but also to point out that the Democrats and the Republicans aren't all that different when it comes to this particular worldview, when it comes to the free market.
Because neoliberalism seems able to sort of encompass the Democratic and the Republican parties because it's a status quotian, maintain the capitalist structure, maybe change policy towards various groups of people, maybe help out the citizenry, but definitely avoid revolution and avoid any sort of nationalization of markets or I would say public services, maybe depublicizing public services is part of it too.
I mean,
the market will solve everything.
Yeah. It's so like, if you want like a modern, as we're recording this, I guess, example, these guys are probably more along the lines politically of somebody like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is receiving a lot of criticism both from the right on the Republican Party, but also from within her own party because she's not towing the neoliberal party line. Yeah.
To make it a little more blunt, these are folks who support Bernie Sanders and feel that any other Democratic candidate is going to be a watered down and sort of system enabling version of Bernie, because Bernie Sanders is an actual democratic socialist, and that is what's required for there to be real change.
Yeah, that's pretty fair, I think. Let's also just define what liberalism is, because it gets thrown around so much in our public discourse nowadays, and it's not used in the tradition of how it was actually defined.
Do you mean the Hoover-Roosevelt tradition?
Or even earlier than that. But the idea that your morals and politics are based on, this is a quote from the dictionary, I believe, is where I pulled this from, liberty, consent of the governed, and equality before law. That's what liberalism traditionally means. Okay, yeah. We just took a big detour to do that. Let's get back to analyzing their fart jokes.
So Colette Shade says about Chapo Trap House, the show's humor can be somewhat impenetrable, relying largely on an elaborate web of references, inside jokes, meta jokes, and recurring characters. I find this to be totally true. I've listened to 3 episodes, and I do find it impenetrable.
Yeah.
I can't really distinguish what is humor and what is genuine. I'm sure that more listening would get me to a place where I could understand it better, but it's a tough sell just dropping into it.
Yeah, I think that's part of why it's attractive to its fandom as well, right? It's like almost like an insular community with walls around it.
Yeah.
And you have to do the work to get through those walls. So
the podcast has had sort of comedy Bang Bang style characters.
Yeah.
People who are doing quote unquote impersonations, actually sort of takedowns, parodies of folks like Peter Dow, the baseball crank, Fethullah Gulen, and William F. Buckley, who is dead. But on top of that, there have been guests on the show who are not comedic impersonations. Folks that we've talked about, names everyone will recognize: China Mieville, Naomi Klein, Barbara Ehrenreich, Cynthia Nixon, Alan Moore, Matt Tabibi, John Cameron Mitchell, Michael Moore, Bernie Sanders, Slavoj Žižek. Did you listen to any of that?
That just
Slavoj
came out
Žižek?
like this week, I think.
Yeah.
I have not listened to that one yet, no.
Andrew Yang and Marianne Williamson, along with comedians that are like not exactly a who's who, but certainly a chunk of the who's who. James Adomian, David Cross, Rob Delaney, Tim Heidecker, Joe Mandy, Patton Oswalt, Bill Corbett, Dave Anthony, and a cartoonist named Michael Kupperman, who I actually don't know.
Oh, Kupperman is like a alternative cartoonist. Most of his stuff is published by Fantagraphics. I'm about to say he's a big name in indie comics, but that's sort of a misnomer, right? Like that doesn't make any sense.
Right.
But I was surprised to find him on there as well. But let's pause for a second. We just listed 3 people running for president right now that have stopped by this show in the last couple of months for an interview. That this is how seriously it's taken. That 3 candidates who are running in the Democratic primary stop by. Now, 2 of those candidates are a little, but Bernie Sanders is, I think, still placing 3rd right now in the rankings as we're recording.
I mean, I don't want to guess at what he is at the moment because it'll probably change by the time this goes up.
That is a fair point, too. We should also note that as we're recording this, he just had a heart attack, so there is some speculation that he might drop out.
Yeah. So even though this show started as a bunch of folks just recording and recording badly a conversation they were having.
Oh, God, the production's terrible.
Well,
at the beginning, at least.
The even worse it gets, right?
Yeah.
It is still important enough and effective enough that folks are using it as a platform and as a connector point.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So let's talk about the folks who are doing the show.
Yeah, so there are 3 regular hosts, and we've got interviews with each of them and quotes about how they kind of came together and made the show. But then I guess they added 2 people since then, and there have been 2 different producers. So all in all, there's I think 6 people involved in the show rotating.
Yes, it is a crew that fluctuates.
It is like the Howard Stern show for Democracy Now! Listeners.
All right. The hosts are always referred to as Twitter celebrities. Not de rigueur, right? That's not what everybody labels them as, but throughout all the research, they are Twitter celebrities. That's the place they live.
Yeah, this is a quote from one of their producers, Brendan. He refers to the corner of Twitter that they come from as if Andy Kaufman and Hunter S. Thompson put on a trivia night every single day. They're also amped up on crank.
Okay. So a absurdist stand-up comedian, a gonzo journalist doing trivia totally out of their mind. That's what that Twitter section is like by one of the people who thinks it's a good thing.
And then this is from, I would say, the main host, Will. He says, before they even started the show, they occupied a strange overlap between what is known as weird and left Twitter, and that this is a niche that might seem odd at first, but upon closer inspection makes perfect sense. Left Twitter should be obvious, but as best as Will can describe, to someone who hasn't shared his specific form of mental illness, that's a joke, weird Twitter describes the loosely defined Dadaist comedic style that grew out of the social network Twitter.
When's the last time you looked at Drill's tweets?
I don't know what that is. So never?
That's weird Twitter.
What is Drill?
Okay. Drill is the Twitter user who, let me see if I can remember it offhand. I'm not owned, I exclaim as I slowly shrink into a corn cob.
No idea what you're talking about.
Okay.
Despite my own politics, I tend to avoid accounts that are all about politics, even if they're funny and making jokes about it. It kind of drives me crazy. And I'll also just say, like, longtime listeners of the show will know I've retreated a lot from social media since we started doing this show. So I only read Twitter like once a day, and I'm very selective about who I follow now.
So our hosts for Chapo Trap House, they are sometimes described as the three hosts or the main hosts. And again, the crew kind of fluctuates. But it says here, the three hosts, Will, Felix, and Matt, met on Twitter. They were a trio guest on the podcast Street Fight Radio, and they mocked the film 13 Hours, which is Michael Bay's rah-rah action movie about the Benghazi attack.
So that sounds very amusing. I genuinely didn't even know that movie existed. Like, reading that sentence during the research, I was like, huh, that sounds ridiculous that somebody even made that, but it also sounds like a joke.
It was John Krasinski's sort of warm-up for the Jack Ryan series.
Is that right? I think this is vaguely ringing a bell now. I'm so used to going to the movies now and at least one of the trailers being a commercial for the military that I just they all kind of just gloss over now.
13 Hours was like that.
Okay.
Moving on. So when they first started their podcast, they were doing it just kind of, they recorded it on YouTube or through YouTube, or they just kind of...
I think they distributed it through YouTube.
Did it, yeah. But then Brendan, who we quoted earlier, he brought them professional recording equipment.
Okay.
And they made a big deal out of that. Actually, one of the episodes I listened to was the first one that Brendan was the engineer on.
Oh, really?
And they were really like, Brendan's going to make us sound great, and if he doesn't, it's the last time we'll ever see him. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So let's define these people a little bit better. Will Menaker is who I said is kind of like the leader. He used to be the assistant editor at Live Right, which is an imprint of W.W. Norton. By the way, this is how they got Alan Moore on the show, because Live Right is the American publisher of Jerusalem. And so Will worked with Alan Moore on that book. I was a little thrown off when he started talking about that in the middle of the interview. I was like, wait a minute, does Chapo Trap House have like a book arm? But it's because of his previous day job.
Yeah.
His father is Daniel Menaker, who is a former executive editor-in-chief at Random House. And he was also the fiction editor at The New Yorker for 20 years. So this is what, I mean, I think most people would say like he comes from like an established literati family based around New York.
And Will says that the humor of the show is basically their own extended. He says, quote, most humor comes out of horrible people doing horrible things in an unself-aware way. And I don't think there's any better venue for that than the U.S. political scene and the media that covers it. So
and he also goes on to talk more about his family. I should have had this higher up on the notes. He says that he's from the Upper West Side and that his mother was also an editor. She was at the New York Times, while his father was the editor at the New Yorker. Okay, so both parents working as editors in very established media.
Yeah, and it's a liberal family, right? Sort of the almost classic. I mean, somebody
This
works
is
at the
like
New York Times.
this is the definition of like a conservative's nightmare of what like families in New York are like. Yeah.
But Will is, and there's such a weird kind of reflection of the blog scene in 2001 to all of this, because Will says the Iraq War turned him against liberalism and toward the left. He said that was a formative moment. Being a liberal Democrat obviously wasn't enough. Now, this is the show. This is one of the seeds of what Chapo Trap House is about. Being a liberal Democrat wasn't enough. Most of them all signed on to the same fucking disaster, meaning the war. All of the major media institutions and people, they all wanted to be part of it, and they all wanted to seem, quote, serious by supporting it and the war on terrorism.
Okay. I'm trying not to throw down my own political position, but that resonates with me. I don't know if it resonates with you, Charlie.
It certainly resonates with me. I do feel the kind of pressure from the the Bernie Sanders and then Donald Trump supporter.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. The people who were like, oh, well, I can't vote for Bernie, so I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. Yeah.
Because I want to see it all blown up. I want to see it all burned down.
Yeah.
Will also says that they aspire to be dirtbag vulgarians and unprofessional, despite the fact that they really care about the show and want it to be as sharp and polished as possible.
Okay.
That is a weird... I as a casual starting listener, I do not find it to be something driven by the desire to be sharp and polished.
No, me either.
It is very, sort of covered. Like,
you have to remember, though, that we have been making podcasts for like 10 years now. And that to us, we pay a lot more attention to this kind of quality. But yes, I agree. I thought it was a little ironic as well. They make a lot of prescriptions for how one should live their life, and then right when they come up to the line, they say, "But don't look to me. Like I'm just kind of out here doing my own thing. I'm not an example or a role model for anything or anybody."
Yeah. So they're, behind their sort of backing off of prescription and their like over the top unprofessionalism, they feel that they have a core of, we want to have an effect. We want something that does exactly what we're setting out to do.
Yeah. The most common example in all of the interviews was they would be asked, like, what is your goal for the podcast? And they would basically say something along the lines of like, oh, we don't have any goals, man. Like, we're just a couple dudes talking in a room. It's just fun. But we really love it when we get letters from people who tell us that because they listened to the show, they started organizing or being an activist politically.
Yeah. So Will says the show is the product of our worldview and senses of humor, which is only possible to do in a venue that is 100% independent and outside of any career path in media and politics.
That I totally sympathize with that.
Incredibly important. Yeah.
Yeah.
They are not a replacement for daytime radio or talk shows. They are not sort of emulating any of the Sunday shows or morning radio in order to be an alternative. They are full on. It's us talking. Hey, come on in and listen. We're going to say whatever the fuck we want.
But also, they're doing this themselves. Despite its success, there is no network behind this. I have to imagine that many networks have approached them in the last couple of years and said, like, hey, you want to get in on this? Yeah. Like, you want some ad at the beginning, you want some fucking podcast? Squarespace money? We got some. And they seem to have held their ground and stayed independent.
Now, we led with Will's quotes because, as one of the other hosts says, Felix Biederman, he says Will does most of the planning. We'll talk with Will about what the show should be about that week, put it in a doc, look it over, but stuff like the readings is almost always Will. But we really don't plan what we're going to actually say beyond some of the cold opens that we write. So it is an improv podcast with some guiding bullet points, some talking points that they want to hit.
Yeah, from what I listened to, it seemed like there's a cold open. Unless there's an interview, there's a cold open, and the cold open is usually like a skit, like sometimes involving a comedian performing a character. And then it's a round table of them discussing one or two articles that were published that week in relation to insane current political events.
Yeah. Will says that he keeps track of news items or stories that would be good for the podcast. The cold opens are usually thought through and actually written out, kind of produced. But then what they really go for and what they feel is what people enjoy the most is, quote, the chemistry between us talking or interviewing a guest and the spontaneity where we are reacting to something that's funny as it happens, much like a listener would.
I think that's fair, but I also want to say, Charlie, there is a drastic difference in this show between when they're interviewing somebody like Alan Moore or Naomi Klein and between the three or four of them just palling around. Like, they take the interviews a lot more seriously.
Yeah, and it's usually one person doing a very thorough interview, right? It's almost like a bonus podcast to the podcast, like out of format kind of episode. This is where all that, like, the impenetrable in jokes, right? The spontaneity is the spontaneity of a group of friends who pull on a deeply felt and long-standing reservoir of in jokes and references that can be triggered just by a few words. And so that's what the podcast does. And that's what a long-term listener, I think, can then experience and really enjoy.
Yeah, Will goes on to say that he sees his role as being the facilitator that lets the improv quality happen and allows for the digressions, but he also kind of keeps them on track. You know, he'll bring them back to talking points.
And Will says that this is the kind of show that he wants to listen to. This is the only thing he really wants to do. He's not a journalist, not an activist. He wants the show to be funny, entertaining, and to treat the audience with the respect that you treat your friends with when you're trying to have fun with them. He says, I have no illusions about changing the world, but it is, this is what you were talking about, but it is heartening to hear from people in person or online who say that our show got them into politics or changed their perspective on something.
Yeah, I'd say that was echoed by all of these guys in like 3 or 4 of the interviews that I collected for the research here.
Yeah. Will also, he says something very succinctly that I like about podcasts in general, like non-corporate media. He thinks that people like the podcast because the hosts as a collective have what he calls no special obligation to be nice to anyone or to get a pat on the head or have a fine debate with their conservative friend. There's not the concerns of a ongoing show that needs advertisers and the support of the media infrastructure.
Yeah, so I agree with you, but also I think that the podcast landscape is changing so quickly that you're still referring to podcasts from 2009.
Yeah, I am.
Really, we're talking about independent podcasting here because 90% of podcasting now is big networks with advertising, just like TV and radio.
This is the revelation that I'm in a little bit of a fantasy world when it comes to podcasting. I still feel like podcasting is mostly the free space that people can just talk into, and that corporate is infringing on that, whereas it's kind of reversed now.
Yeah, it's totally reversed. And from my personal experience, there are lots of hosts out there who feel like they have a special obligation to be nice to someone and get a pat on the head. So, I don't think that what these guys are doing is the norm in the world of podcasting anymore.
So let's move on to the next host, Matt Christman, or Christman. He is described as, and this is, I'm having a hard time not just laughing through this whole thing. He is described as being stout and Midwestern and unemployed for years, moving around the country with his wife, who is an academic librarian.
Wow.
A traveling academic librarian. Have MLIS, will travel.
That hits a little close to home. But it's also, it's interesting to hear it because it's, again, so far, like, as we're describing these guys, it is what every conservative's nightmare is about who's voting on the other side of the aisle, right? Like, this guy's unemployed, he just mooches off of his wife, and this other guy, he just grew up in this literati rich family in New York City, right? Like, it's exactly their stereotype.
Now, the Midwestern for Matt is that he lives in Cincinnati, and he is recorded through Google Hangout when they're doing the podcast. There's the engineer blends Matt's audio into the podcast.
Is what we do. They're doing the same thing we do. He just records on his end and then sends it over to them.
But instead of you being there and me being here, they have a group, and then there's an additional, flown in voice.
So Christman says that the reason why he came to left Twitter and eventually this show is because he took a lot of his frustration and confusion and he dumped it all online. This guy is real smart when it comes to Marxism and philosophy. He really kind of, like, when I was listening to him on the show, he's the guy who just drops a lot of science on you, in a good way. And he does that in some of the interviews too. So he sort of defines what Marxism means in reference to the show. And he says Marxism is thought of as a doctrinaire And a lot of people want it to be that way. Knowing the XYZ to every power of every doctrinaire point is much less important, however, than having a heuristic for analyzing things, shit like superstructure and base. So this is classic. I'm back in grad school.
This is a grad student who doesn't have to be polite. You know, the phrase "shit like superstructure and base" is kind of hilarious, and also kind of, it just seems very put on. It's hard to tell what's going on here.
Well, to be fair, the article that was pulled from, the interviewer was like, "Can you define what Marxism is for me?"
Yeah.
And Matt was like, "This is the difference between superstructure and base. This is how we're trying to talk about it on the show."
And so Matt makes it very clear that he and probably the rest of the podcast crew, they want to make the distinction between the political economic structure that drives a nation state and the cultural arguments or cultural product that exist on top of that. Mm-hmm. So that they don't want to have arguments about Beyonce, right? They don't want to talk about the video of Formation. They think that, well, let me read this quote from him, because it's both, it seems correct, and it's also like one of the serious problems I have with how these guys approach things.
Okay.
So every time there's a fucking Beyonce argument that consumes the culture, just knowing what base and superstructure is simplifies things so much in terms of understanding what's going on and not getting caught up in an argument about how revolutionary Lemonade is or whatever.
Charlie, are you familiar with Beyonce's Lemonade?
I am familiar with Beyonce's Lemonade.
Okay.
And the reason that people think it was, if not revolutionary, then important.
Okay, cool. I just wanted to make sure that wasn't like a sticking point.
No. My sticking point is that that's a very kind of, the way that people are trying to craft culture, guide culture, communicate, and sort of declare a sense of themselves in the world, that's not important. Mm-hmm. It's all economics. Mm-hmm. I feel like that's like thinking that no one votes because of what they think. They only vote because of how much money they have in the bank.
Okay. I'm personally just having a little difficulty following your argument there, but I can see why this kind of stuff is irritating.
Oh, we're just trying to recreate a Chapo trap house argument right now.
Okay. Matt goes on to say that he thinks that the reason why this show is really successful is because the traditional rhetoric of leftist political and media critique that we're used to is either smug and above it all, like The Daily Show, or it's quavering voiced earnestness. Again, totally resonates with me. I absolutely understand where he's coming from. He says neither of those models offer the visceral thrill of listening to people who actually give a shit, as opposed to the wan liberalism of people who are mostly just interested in showing how much smarter they are than Republicans, but who don't believe in having a sense of humor, or that having a sense of humor can be counter-revolutionary. This is something I encounter every day.
Yeah. So let's restart that real quick. Matt says this is not smug leftist satire, and it is not earnest inside the system media presentations. Mm. This is people who really care and are happy to have a sense of humor about what they care about instead of being super serious revolutionaries.
Yeah, let me give you an example. I've mentioned before on our show that I tend to watch a lot of Seth Meyers' late night show on YouTube. I find it cathartic. It is usually not funny to me. Most of the jokes are pretty terrible, but I find it to be a good way to sort of boil down all the news that I already read that day into something that's like a little bit more palatable and makes me feel less alone on this planet. At the same time, I agree with what Matt is saying here, that like when I'm watching it, or The Daily Show or any other of the late night comedies, it doesn't genuinely feel like those people want change. They just want to make fun of what's going on right now, and they want everything to go back to, quote, normal. I think the folks on Chapo Trap House are saying it was never normal in the first place.
I'm put in mind of the old television ads for the magazine The National Review. or excuse me, National Review, the conservative magazine,
Yeah.
in which Tom Selleck would look you, the viewer, in the eye and say, I love reading the National Review. It's informative and it's a very funny magazine, too.
Is that right? I've never seen this before.
Well, you were not getting high at the right times of day.
Okay. This is post Magnum PI. I almost said Hawaii 5-0.
But, so Tom Selleck, and here's why I bring it up. Tom Selleck saying that National Review is a very funny magazine is probably an insane proposition to a number of people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just like someone saying, oh, yeah, The Daily Show is really witty and gives me what I need. Or,
yes.
Oh, yeah, Seth Meyers, man, he's hilarious and he's really pushing, the edges of what's important or whatever you want to say.
Let me see if I'm going to probably fuck this up, but let me see if I can tie this up.
I'd love to hear you fuck it up.
I had a colleague when I was in grad school who wrote a discourse theory paper about The Daily Show in 2007. And his argument was essentially something like, The Daily Show is fine and all, and it's nice that it makes us laugh and feel cathartic and better about ourselves after, a tough day of politics or whatnot. But all it is irony, and irony is just us kind of laughing at our own cage.
Right. This is actually the Mark Fisher stuff.
Yeah, in
this
a lot of ways.
The capitalist realism thing where by performing some kind of rejection or resistance, you sort of complete the need to resist or reject, but then continue to exist within.
Yep.
And that's actually
there's no push for revolution or revolution is a tough word for some people to swallow, but any kind of change.
Yeah. A lot of what Matt says in the interview we've got from him is saying again and again, we are serious about what we care about, but we don't let that keep us from having a sense of humor. He says, too many people in whatever the hell the progressive movement is are primarily interested in maintaining a brand or position within it.
Totally true.
He feels like that makes it so that people are essentially crafting messages. He talks about Milo Yiannopoulos and says that he knows what buttons to push to guarantee an outraged response.
Yeah.
And yet Matt says our hate, as Alexander Cockburn said, is pure. The genuineness and the truthfulness and the unmasked, uncynical.
This is sort of what it comes back to, is that they actually, they argue that their crassness is okay because they actually care. Because at the end of the day, their motivation is for human beings to not suffer.
Well, I think they also argue that their crassness is necessary.
Right. That too. For instance, Matt says about Milo, he says he wouldn't piss on his legion of dullard virgin worshippers if they were on fire, but he knows exactly what buttons to push. Yeah. Which is sort of rings true for me as well. Like, this is the thing that I'm getting from Chapo Trap House is many of the crass things they say are things that I think to myself during the day, but don't necessarily have an opportunity to articulate out loud.
Let's talk about the next host, Felix Biederman. And Biederman is when there's a moment when I start feeling like this is a sitcom that's being proposed.
What you wanna? This is a sitcom when you pitch like, these are our three characters.
Yeah,
all right. They all live together in an apartment in Brooklyn, and the third guy is a freelance writer, but he's also a mixed martial arts hobbyist.
Yeah, so this is his bio. He was a freelance writer and mixed martial arts hobbyist in New York City, who also says that he's read up on how the Senate worked. And, quote, you lose a lot of your illusions about the Senate as this great deliberative necessary body, and you see it for what it is, which is this aristocratic anachronism that retards the necessary processes.
Right. This is the old adage about watching your sausage get made.
Right. He grew up in Chicago, Felix did. He says, I fucking hated Hyde Park. It's a very stratified, snobbish area. It's a lot of well-meaning liberal people that live in the city that is operated by criminals in the Democratic Party. I'm going to go back to the beginning of this quote again, because I want to tell the listener, I want to tell you this is the podcast, right? This is like,
this is the tone of the show.
Yeah. This is the seed of what they're struggling to change or distinguish their left politics from democratic politics.
Mm-hmm.
Hyde Park, Felix says, was a lot of well-meaning liberal people that live in Chicago, operated by criminals in the Democratic Party who know what should be done to ameliorate the horrors that they see all around them, but don't personally affect them. This is a city born in segregation and inequality and racist policing and murderous extra-legal executions.
It sounds like he's describing every city that I've lived in as an adult.
Yeah, and would that be any different if you lived in a different time?
That's a good question, right? And which sort of brings me back to my starter for this episode, which is like, oh my God, we live in the past. We don't live in a dystopian future. We live in the past.
Felix, he says that when the podcast first started, quote, I don't think we imagined more than 200 people from Twitter listening. So anything past that is a pleasant surprise. This is a dated quote. I don't think you can say that, for a Chapo Trap House now, because it has 33,000 Patreon supporters and makes, as you said, over $1 million a year.
We'll get into that after we get through this section about the hosts and how they produce the show and everything. But yeah, the economic model behind this is massive.
Felix also says that the thing people seem to enjoy was that the podcast was vulgar and irreverent. He says maybe it's spending too much time on the parts of the internet where you can say nearly anything you want, but I didn't think that of us. Meaning, he didn't think that they were over the top. He thought that they were just sort of regular. But then when he started listening to the other podcasts that were being sort of compared to Chapo Trap House, he realized, what bootlickers, he says, most other shows are by comparison.
He also says that they didn't set out to shock and disgust people. They weren't trying to be shock jocks like my Howard Stern comparison. He said, we're just being ourselves and representative of people we've known in political spaces over the years. This is going to be important when we come back to talking about representation in this show, because there's a lot of argument saying this is all fine and good, but you're a bunch of white dudes who are all just sitting around talking to each other and there's no diversity at the table. However, there is now.
And Felix points out that the podcast was, he says, if you seek out to appear as irreverent, you're gonna blow it. He says that they are themselves, and that's what people are responding to. They pay special attention to their discussion being listenable, but they imbue it with their own qualities of vulgarity and irreverence. He also talks a little bit about sort of the group that they're going for. Mm-hmm. The people who might enjoy listening to their podcast, the reason that they might connect with an audience. He says there's a very large group of people that are amenable to ideas like socialized medicine, less foreign intervention, and other things we've long been told don't have popular support. Left media has been the dominion of either upper middle class smugness, when it's even the least bit funny, and insufferable self-righteousness when it's even the least bit conscious. They keep talking about how we want to be funny without being snobbish. We want to be genuine without being self-righteous. That's their thing.
And that gets into a term, he uses it here. We're going to unpack it at the end of this episode because there's a lot going on with this. But I had not heard this before. The dirtbag left is how they're referred to. Apparently, that is a term that they coined themselves, but then has sort of broadened out beyond the show. But he says the dirtbag left is for people that don't think we should rain fire down on Yemeni children, but neither wish to lecture or act smugly just because they hold these beliefs. It's for people that see politics as more than just a linguistic group. For too long, they've been told that they can't support both strong welfare in the state or laugh at schmegma jokes. Now they get to say, why the fuck not? Again, totally resonates with me. Very sympathetic.
The one thing I want to point out about that is that it does seem like they are suggesting that by getting outraged and saying things like, it's just fucking bullshit, man. It's fucking bullshit. That somehow
it's Charlie at a party in the 90s after too many drinks.
Totally. But they're saying that is a sort of a removal of smugness and self-righteousness.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying these folks are faultless.
I don't, this is not a critique of the show so much as I do want to point out that
there is a bit of
that
hypocrisy.
is their technique, right?
Yeah.
To avoid smugness and self-righteousness, they use vulgarity. That's their kind of mode.
Yep. Yeah. So I mentioned before that there's a lack of diversity. Those were the 3 hosts when the show started. They added 2 more hosts later on. One is a woman named Amber Ali Frost, who I believe is the person who coined the term dirtbag left and is Will Menaker's roommate, or was his roommate. The other is Virgil Texas. One of the interviews described him as Asian American, and he said, I don't describe myself that way, but if you want to describe me that way, that's fine. Yeah. So, but this was, I think, their attempt to add voices to the room that weren't white folks.
Yeah. And it's weird that there's a real gap in how Chapo Trap House is sort of rendered in the media and how it's discussed or connected to by their audience.
Yeah.
Like, there haven't been a whole bunch of features that talk about how Amber Frost is integrating into the show, or what Virgil Texas brings to it. It's like
a lot of the articles came out in 2 waves. The first wave was when the show hit a real stride right after the election. The second wave was after their book came out. There hasn't been a lot of analysis since then, despite its continued popularity. And I suspect a lot of that has to do with what they're arguing, which is like the media doesn't know what to do with them because it doesn't fit into their narrative.
Yeah, there's only so many times you'll say, hey, I understand that you think that I'm a fucking idiot, but could you talk to me about why?
Right. Yeah. So there's 2 other people that have been involved in the show. I think there's sometimes voices, but they're mostly production people. Brendan James, who we mentioned earlier, but he left the show in November of 2017. He's been replaced by someone named Chris Wade. Most of the interview stuff takes place with Brendan James because, like I said, of those 2 waves of
he was the producer at the time that people really started paying attention.
Yeah. James says the basis of the comedy for the hosts or their analysis is not just that people suck and that the media and politics are gross, but that the world doesn't have to be this way. If it was just, well, this is how it is, let's just go down laughing, then that would be The Daily Show. This is what I mean about the laughing at your own cage kind of thing.
Right. So they're very particular about, they think that most of the popular political satire is toothless and really just meant for you to be able to lean back and go, oh yeah, the people I don't agree with are idiots.
I'm better than them. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And he also says, Comedy Central and Andy Borowitz are sort of the same thing when it comes to political thought action or whatever that just doesn't happen in the work that Comedy Central, i.e. The Daily Show, or Andy Borowitz, who does that weird satire report. These are the things that people pass around on Facebook, right? Mm-hmm. Right. Andy Borowitz, publications, and clips from The Daily Show.
Dude, let me tell you, I mean, like, some of my best friends, they will send me an email and it's just a link to, some Daily Show clip or something. And like, look at this. This is, it makes us feel camaraderie. It makes us feel like we're not alone, which I get. Like, I just admitted, like, I watch Seth Meyers pretty much every day, but I'm also conscious of the fact that it has a lot of limitations.
Yeah. Brendan was a fan who was on the show as a guest in episode 3, and he brought with him his recording know-how at that time. He says, up until episode 3, the guys were recording the show as a raw feed. I offered to fine-tune it. He downloads audio tracks. This is what he said. I download their audio tracks and go through the whole tape to trim the fat and add songs and audio of anything they reference. So basically, Brendan showed up and turned it into a podcast as opposed to a recording of Will, Matt, and Felix's conversations.
Yeah, yeah. He tries to make the music and clips be the 4th character on the show. I think this is, again, they might disagree, but this is why it feels like Howard Stern to me, because there's like little audio things that'll pop up here or there, little jokes, songs playing in the background. It's almost like somebody's got like one of those soundboards in front of them. They just have like a button that they're pushing every time, you know.
But he's listening and trying to produce it.
Yeah.
He's not just adding stuff in the moment. He's actually going back and trying to find the moments that can be improved by additional audio.
Yeah. So let's try to summarize that part before we get into the economic model here. So we're talking about three friends who met on Twitter in the mid 2010s. They had similar political beliefs and humor, and they started a podcast together. This fourth guy came in after a couple episodes and was like, here, let me try to make the production a little bit better on this. Then after they became aware that there was a diversity problem on the show, they added 2 more hosts, and it's very successful. It's very popular. And now we get to talk about the money part, which is the part that almost none of the other researchers, I talk about Paste Magazine like it's a researcher, articles addressed at all. So this is how a show works. Their episodes are between 60 and 80 minutes long. We mentioned before, they start with a cold open. There's sometimes an interview, or it's just them doing commentary, talking to each other. Then Brendan adds audio samples in post-production. Well,
not Brendan anymore. Let's be sure about that. Like, this is how they defined the episode style.
Yes, this is true. Okay. They usually feature a reading series where they will feature texts by conservative writers. So it's them sort of making fun of these texts.
Right.
Now, you get free episodes through your podcatcher of choice, but subscribers contribute $5 a month, and they gain access to additional weekly premium bonus episodes. Now, my understanding is before they even were on Patreon, they had like a subscription service that they were using, and they switched over to Patreon as their model.
Chris, before we get into the money, I just want to make sure that we also hit this. The theme song of the podcast and the reason that it's called what it is Salute to El Chapo Part 1 by DJ Smokey. And the reason it's Chapo Trap House is because they wanted it to sound a little bit like it was a mixtape when they first started doing it.
Yeah. Thank you. I haven't lived in Atlanta in a while, so my mixtape vernacular is a little off.
Okay, get down and dirty, Chris. Tell me about the money.
As of our recording this right now in October of 2019, they have 32,000 plus patrons, and they make $143,972 a month off of doing this show. That is $1.7 million a year. I'll also point out that that's just the money that they're getting off the show. It doesn't include merchandise or their books. All right.
Or their live shows, which they also do.
Live shows, right. I did some quick math, all right? Assuming that all 6 of them get paid the exact same thing, that's $283,000 per person that's involved in this show. That doesn't include their production costs. But you and I know from listening to their show and producing our own show that the production costs aren't going to cut into it that much.
No.
Now, here's for reference, all right? This is the kind of thing that I don't normally do, but I think I'm okay with sharing this now. Before I was on Super Context and I was a, quote, professional podcaster and I worked for a network, I was paid $45,000 a year to host 2 top 100 podcasts and write articles for the web and video bits as well. So that's just to give you reference. Like your average person who's just working for a podcast company and producing content is making way less than these guys who are doing this thing on their own. And that is fascinating. I think it is the big hook about this show, what makes it work so well.
And the reason you said top 100 is because in 2016, it was 69th most popular news and politics podcast in iTunes. It was ranked over Katie Couric's interview show and NPR's podcast Morning Edition.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm saying here, and there is a lot of variation between the corporations that you're working for in the podcasting world and how much they're paying you versus how much the shows are actually making. But if you're in the top 100, like they are and some of the shows I hosted were, there's usually an advertising model that's associated with that. And that advertising model, based on CPMs, determines how much money you get paid for the ad reads that you do. And in a perfect world, that would also determine what your salary is. I don't think that's the case most of the time. But for these guys, because they're bypassing all of that shit, they don't have advertising. They're not dealing with any of that. They're just going directly to their consumers.
And this is what Will says about that. If you have ambition in your life to do something other than something you would get paid for, then I think you would be amenable to left-wing politics. It's about creating a space of freedom for people in their lives that is independent of the marketplace.
Yeah. So this is very similar to our episode on Welcome to Night Vale. Similar model, similar setup. They and same thing in that, like, they started producing shows and then it grew. They created a subscription model around it. Then they created merchandise and they started doing live shows. It's become its own thing.
Yeah. It's interesting to me, too, that Will says, in terms of comparing it to the job that he left at a publishing house, that the ambition in your life to do something other than something you would get paid for, they get paid for the podcast now.
Probably more than they ever got paid for any of the jobs they had before. Yeah.
But there's this, it's this distinction of the marketplace from labor and sort of self-expression or creator-owned kind of product.
Yeah. I mean, I would also throw this out there, which you and I are pretty conscious of, and I'm sure they are as well, that that's not sustainable, right? Like, there's no way that they're going to continue for the rest of their lives making that much money off of this podcast. There's going to be ebbs and flows, and they're probably prepared for that.
I hope that they're stashing it.
Right. So then I found this article, Charlie, that I didn't know about and is extremely relevant to you and I and what we do with this show, but it was in reference to their show. So
let me preface this. Preface this, Chris, with saying, hey, listeners, if you don't know what Patreon is, please go to patreon.com/supercontext as we read this to you.
Yeah, and in about 10 minutes, you'll get a Patreon ad from us as well. But so there is apparently a conservative argument against Kickstarter and Patreon.
Yeah, it's amazing. I actually love this in the way that people find horrible things delicious. It's fantastic. So
this article is written by Jack Smith IV. And Smith defines what Patreon and Kickstarter are for people who may not know. He says, instead of paying for the projects, you're paying a small amount of cash monthly to support a show or the person. So, for instance, if you're a comic book writer making stories about LGBTQ superheroes, again, a little close to home, or a programmer that's making erotic video games, you can get the money to create the work that a gatekeeper like a record label or a publisher would never put money behind. Okay, we are intimately familiar with this, but just in case. However, conservative argument goes like this. One person's monthly stipend for creative work is seen as another person's pathetic handout. Reactionary online conservatives are worried about the slow creep of social justice issues on the internet and see Patreon as a way for social justice warriors to live fat off of the generosity of others. They refer to this as hipster welfare. I didn't realize we were on hipster welfare, Charlie.
Yeah. Here is hipster welfare defined by the Urban Dictionary. Living off of monthly donations from Patreon for bad art or, quote, important work, unquote, usually of the social justice variety, which is often subpar or unsellable otherwise. Basically, receiving the financial equivalent of a pity fuck.
So I guess I didn't know that it was defined as such. I am familiar with trolls on the internet coming after creators who are using Patreon or Kickstarter, but I didn't realize that this had been sort of coalesced into some kind of like actual rhetoric. Like I've definitely seen before, for instance, like a comic anthology that's getting kickstarted have a bunch of trolls go after it because one of the creators in the anthology is like vocal and politically left.
Yeah, it's like you're cheating. They're saying you're cheating. You're ducking the marketplace, which again is just such a crazy, ironic
Well,
thing.
it's also sort of like missing the whole point of what the marketplace is.
Exactly,
If you look
yeah.
at how Patreon works. Yeah.
Now, Matt Kreisman, who we've been talking about, he redefines it for us also. He says, conservatives see people who take to Patreon as failures in the free market of creative endeavor, who are getting charity from like-minded social justice warriors because no one wants their crappy ideological art in the first place. A successful Patreon defers the punishment that God and the market has ordained.
Now, this is even funnier.
It's fantastic.
For this article, the writer went to Jack Conte, the CEO and creator of Patreon, and asked him for a quote. And he said, "We know that there are undeserved communities that have had discussion and membership, but nobody was getting paid until a service like Patreon came around. When you put a $sign on it, it becomes very clear how powerful and how large niche communities actually are."
I think there is no better time in this episode for us to take a break and tell you, the listener, about our Patreon.
Hey, Charlie, this is the segment where we get to pitch our hipster welfare and, basically live off the fat off the generosity of others.
Yeah.
As it was put so eloquently in the article that we just referenced. So this is a little odd, us doing this spot here, but it also seems appropriate.
Yeah. You're making it almost impossible for me to say seriously things like, Super Context is made possible by listeners through our Patreon campaign, and the community it has created on the site has transformed the show.
Yeah, I wouldn't agree necessarily with the arguments that were presented from that article there, but I would agree, weirdly enough, with the CEO from Patreon, who we don't always see eye to eye on things, but there is community to be made here in these niche groups of people who have been underserved by the media in their lives up until now.
Yeah, and I absolutely believe that this is the marketplace that we're in. Even if there is a kind of emotional component to people saying, "Oh, I want to support this project," this is still the marketplace because we have to pay for stuff, hosting fees, the media artifacts we research. Although I should say, neither one of us supported Chapo Trap House to be able to hear those other episodes. That was just a nest we were not going to engage. But we've been keeping our equipment updated also because of our Patreon supporters. And we have plans. The more patrons we get, the more that comes in each month. We can do things like transcribe every episode, maybe even create a job for an intern, and eventually travel to be in the same sweet, sweet recording studio with each other once again.
Which I believe is one of the things that the Chapo Trap House people do as well. I would just say their model is subscription, right? You get extra episodes. We do that too, but we got some other things as well. As rewards for supporting us on Patreon, you will get things like outtakes, blooper reels. We do bi-weekly bonus mini episodes, and then we also do a monthly shadow podcast. It's an entire episode of Super Context that doesn't go out on the other feed, all about Stephen King adaptations. This month, we are doing Children of the Corn.
Ooh-wee.
Oh boy, it's a hot mess. It's going to be a real interesting episode to talk about. But our patrons also get to do things like choose topics or ask us questions or even support us as sponsors with live ad reads.
Yeah. You can go to patreon.com/supercontext. You can check out all the reward tiers. You can see the episodes we have done. Coming up are going to be episodes on Tilly Walden and Janelle Monáe. We would love for you to check out the Patreon. If you do go to the Patreon site for Super Context, you will see that for every one of our patrons, unless they ask us not to, we thank them personally in each episode. And here and now is when we're going to do that. We got a couple new patrons to say thank you to. The podcast, Rein It In, Matt and Rachel, along with Melinda Hale, our new patrons. Thank you so much for joining us. And also, I have to cop to something, Chris.
Uh-oh.
Do you remember when I changed up the order of the names to make it interesting for us?
I do, yeah.
Well, guess what?
Let's see, you left people out?
I fucking left people out. I had a cut and paste disaster, and I took out 2 of our patrons, which was a asshole move on my part. So I'd like to say right now, Andy Riggs, Calvin Ellis, I am so sorry that we have not been saying your name. That's on me. It was totally a mistake, and you are beloved, as are all the rest of our patrons.
I will make sure, Andy and Calvin, that Charlie is flogged the appropriate amount of times.
Ooh,
but
yes,
for
please.
now, let's go forward and just thank everybody the old-fashioned alphabetical way and say thank you to Alex Laird, Amit Doshi, Andy Riggs, Bennett Callahan, Beth Barnett, Billy Whitehouse, Brian Chovanich, and Carolyn Zoids.
Thank you to Chris Marlton, Cliff Landis, Coco, Dan Haynes, Dave Jordan, Dave Wachter, Eilish Phillips, Elijah Tilstra, Evan Mapstone, and Fred Rasco.
Thank you to Ira James Udiskin, Jason Puckett, Jess Staten, Jill Kaufman, Joseph Aleo, Calvin Ellis, Carmela Padovich, Kate Sharon, and Kevin Wetter.
Thank you to Christian Hirvala, Lee Fowler, Liliana Gill, Lokesh Dakar, Miriam Meany, Misha Moon, Nathan Weatherford, Nick Sage, and Patrick Malka.
And thank you to Pete Bow, R.M. Rhodes, Rob Sloan, Robert Negoesco, Roman Marichek, Ron Bilodeau, Ross Llewellyn, Ryan O'Neill, Simon Workman, Thomas Tremberger, and Whitney Buchanan.
Oh, you took a bigger chunk right there at the end, Chris. Were you afraid I would leave someone off?
If you want Charlie to forget that you're one of our patrons, please go to patreon.com/supercontext.
And we're back. So we've been talking about Chapo Trap House's sort of mode of communication and how it is that they're making their money. But let's try and get a sense of who's listening to them. How many people?
All right, this is a shot in the dark, all right?
Yeah.
It's not like I downloaded their numbers off of Libsyn or something like that. But you and I know a little bit about podcasting and about analytics of numbers. So we know from their Patreon that they have 32,000 paid listeners. Based on our experience, usually about 10% of your audience is your paid audience on Patreon. So I would guess that they have somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 listeners.
And the one caveat to add to that is that since they have a podcast feed that only every other episode is available if you're not a Patreon, that might swing the percentage higher,
That's
the paid
true.
listeners. But still, it's a ton of people.
To give you an idea, the benchmark, thought of the threshold for whether you get ads on a podcast or not
There you go.
is if you have at least 50,000 downloads per episode. They have 32,000 people paying them money directly to listen to the show. So they must have well over 50,000 people downloading the show. So this is a very successful show. And I think what this also shows you is that there is a market of at least 500,000 people out there who want something like this, who, whether or not they agree with the politics, want to listen to conversations like this.
Yeah. Reason Magazine reported in, I think, 2018 that the socialist podcast, Chapo Trap House, which debuted in March 2016, is now the second most popular account on the crowdfunding platform Patreon. As of today,
It's number one.
number one by patron count and by earnings.
I think the other, unless it's changed recently, I think the other one that's really popular is called Last House on the Left or Last Podcast on the Left. And it's a horror podcast.
Yeah, that's one of them. You would be delighted and horrified if you went looking at the products of some of the other Patreons that are very, very popular.
Yeah, I did that a year ago when we started our Patreon. I don't need that kind of horror in my life right now.
The Guardian.
I just want
Go
to
ahead.
point out, you kind of just glossed over that it was Reason Magazine. That article from Reason Magazine, which will be linked to in our show notes, by the way, was basically like oh my God, the horror. These socialists are growing in numbers and millennials are becoming socialists.
Now, don't forget that the Reason's tone is more like, Jesus Christ, can you believe this? Look at this fucking shit.
Right. But this wasn't just about Chapo Trap House. They were also taking a look at the broader effect of socialism on American politics, but they were using the numbers for like Chapo Trap House or the socialist magazine Jacobin as a metric, basically.
Yeah. And then The Guardian said Chapo Trap House's success speaks to the absence of a genuinely socialist, let alone funny presence in American culture. One that recognizes both the Democrats and Republicans as bidding for the capitalist class.
Mm-hmm.
This is, this is a English newspaper, right? Or a United Kingdom newspaper.
Yeah.
And Matt Kreisman even says, we always wonder what these London and Irish people get from us talking about these American pundits.
I think that we have our own British listeners who can chime in on this.
Sure.
I suspect that there's a certain amount of solidarity, that they are experiencing the same thing.
Yeah, it speaks to how these guys are thinking of the podcast also, that, one, it's being referenced by, media outlets that are trying to diagnose the culture, and then they're saying, they're saying it out loud. We don't know what the hell people get from us if they're not American left, outraged listeners.
So we've got a little bit of a handle on the economics of this show and about how many people are listening, right? Real rough numbers. We don't know exactly. But we do know that, this is a popular enough of model. They have merchandise. They sell T-shirts with their slogans and things like that on them. But they also had a book published. And the book was called The Chapo Guide to Revolution. And, man, I found a pretty fascinating review of this of this book on Politico's website by Bill Scher, who I believe, if it's the Bill Scher I'm thinking of, he's kind of a established reviewer of stuff like this.
Well, he writes like an established reviewer. He takes a certain amount of liberty that says someone who doesn't expect to have anything blow back on them.
Let's just kick this off by saying this guy's furious at these people. This is the traditionalist response to this show and what they say about mainstream media.
So we should say Chapo Guide to Revolution was published by Atria Books, which is part of Simon & Schuster.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then Bill says, have you lived through the past 3 presidents and managed to still believe that Republicans and Democrats share a single corporatist overlord? Do you casually use neoliberal as an insult, even though nobody has spotted a neoliberal in the wild since Gary Hart's 1984 presidential campaign? Do you enjoy history lectures, but only when they are delivered by sarcastic, self-righteous people who conveniently omit anything that conflicts with their ideological worldview? Well, then, do I have a book for you?
That's how he starts off his article about their book.
And that encompasses...
I have not read their book, by the way. This is all I have to go on.
Chapo Trap House sentiment. That pretty much is what people think when they don't like the podcast.
This is kind of like Hillary Clinton looking down on AOC. Or even more recently saying that Tulsi Gabbard is a Russian plant.
God. Now, Scher actually does, he does agree with Chapo Trap House's sort of own sense of self in that he says, at bottom, the podcast and the book feels like an actual unironic infomercial scheme. They make bank by selling you a candy-coated version of socialism, one that may offend real socialists even more than liberal gruel peddlers like myself. He thinks that they are serious. Mm-hmm. He thinks that it is vulgar and fun and that people can get into it as opposed to finding it serious and revolutionary.
He also says that they're averse to hard work and that extends to their book. So this is the argument, like, these are just 3 fucking layabouts who they don't want to actually work for a living, and they came from these privileged backgrounds, and they just want to soak up some money from Patreon.
You're right that that's what some people think, but you need to read the quote.
Yeah. So he says, their aversion to hard work extends into this book. Why suffer the details of how this non-worker's paradise, which is free of paper pushing and ditch digging, is going to be realized when you can take in more than $1 million a year by dressing up your stale arguments and thin policy ideas with your inside jokes? The infomercial socialists of Chapo have exploited the free market expertly and at least saved themselves from a 9-to-5 prison.
Okay. Now, that's a clear dismissal in Politico. Okay. But then there's this crazy thing. Mike Gravel
Yeah.
filed for an exploratory committee for a possible 2020 presidential run based on a group of students who are Chapo Trap House listeners who convinced him to run.
Yeah.
That's the story, right?
There are articles out there that support this. Yeah.
And
there's also apparently it's popular in Italy.
at least it's noticed in Italy.
Yeah, Italy's weekly news magazine L'Espresso, which Charlie and I have no idea, where that falls politically, but they attribute this show to the rising membership of the Democratic Socialists of America.
So there you go. It is influential. It does have an effect. Also, its vulgarity is validated by what happens with the listeners. The subreddit for Chapo Trap House has been quarantined by Reddit itself due to significant issues with reporting and addressing violations of the Reddit content policy, especially encouragement of violence.
Yeah. So this is, by the way, this is not without precedent. This is something that happens on Reddit a lot, apparently. I'm not a big Redditor, but Reddit has exhibited a trend of quarantining and removing online communities that deal in fringe politics. They quarantined the subreddit that's the Donald Trump fan Reddit, I guess. I don't know what you would call it. That happened in June. There was an increase in posts that were calling for violence against government officials there. They've also removed things. I don't know what these are, Charlie. The Reddit for Friend World and Honkler, which are apparently white nationalists. They had white nationalist rhetoric on them. Chapo often made fun of these other subreddits getting banned themselves. So there is a certain amount of irony in the fact that then they have also been quarantined.
Okay. We've talked about this already, but let's go ahead and close the loop on this. The Guardian expresses some uncertainty about the diversity of Chapo Trap House.
Yeah.
Quote, though the cultural expression of a multiracial and diverse movement, it is, podcast, mainly white and male. The hosts have been accused of sexism by others on the left. During one scandal, they came under fire for making a joke about Bill Cosby, in response to which they apologized and made a donation to a rape and sexual assault center. Also, now this is extraordinary. I feel very unbalanced when I hear this next part because I want to immediately jump on it as an argument, but then I also feel like, okay, I need numbers to be able to do this. But The Guardian says, Chapo's attempt to reconstruct a heroic story of American socialism runs the risk of overlooking the racist, patriarchal elements of U.S. labor history. It's a concern they swiftly dispatch. Kreisman says, unionized white people are the least racist white people in the working class, and it's especially meaningless now because the working class is made up of minorities anyway. And says that the labor movement has been a primary driver of integration in the United States.
Okay. So basically saying, like, even though we're white guys and we support this, that there is a history of a connection to a like multicultural audience. Right.
And that unions were on the front lines of racial
civil
justice.
rights. Yeah.
Yeah. Shade also refers back to Beyonce and Hamilton and even Aaron Sorkin as targets by Chapo Trap House.
They hate the West Wing. They hate it.
Shade then says, the show's reputation is as a rowdy bro fest. This is likely not helped by the fact that all three hosts are straight white men who frequently talk over each other, make jokes about genitalia, and use a Gucci Mane song for their theme music. And Reason calls this whole podcast a group therapy session for Bernie bros.
You know, I have to be honest that for a while there, when people would use the term Bernie bro derisively, I didn't exactly know what they were talking about. And when I did listen to this, I was like, oh, okay. Like, I think I see where this is coming from now. In my head, Bernie bros were more like super wealthy CEOs who were also like really into surfing and Bernie Sanders.
So the bro part of all this, though, we can look at what Gia Tolentino wrote in The New Yorker. When an ethos of vulgarity is enthusiastically practiced by a group of white men, this will sometimes translate as chauvinism. Particular strains of Chapo invective can be hard to take. People are, quote, pussies, or they're, quote, retarded. Botanical gardens are, quote, gay. Hillary Clinton is a, quote, freak. The caricature of the Bernie bro, an aggressively disaffected white guy who hates Hillary Clinton ostensibly because of her neoliberal incrementalism, but deep down because of her gender, occasionally seems to apply.
So they address this when they were asked about this in an interview. And Christman says, for people who can't get our podcast because it's too doodly, I get it. I don't have a problem with that. I totally can understand it. But people who want to use that to delegitimize what we're saying, that is different.
Yeah, and he does just say, look, we are dudes who just do this. Sort of a, in a way, it's the argument that, look, we just happen to be guys. We're not trying to make a case that only guys should do this.
He also says, look, representation in the media at large is the real issue, not just with them. And that applies to larger institutions like the Times or CNN. And he says specifically when we need to be worried about representation, it's because there's barriers to entry that preserve gender or racial hierarchies at those institutions. He said, by contrast, we're just these dudes.
And this is kind of the rhetoric maybe that led to bringing on Frost in Texas on purpose. The comedian Virgil Texas that we mentioned before was a frequent guest. And Frost was somehow socially connected to the podcast hosts. And there is I have noticed this with people who support Bernie Sanders for president. There's a certain kind of let us talk about the true problem, which is confused by being focused on diversity.
Okay.
So Matt Kreisman says, the 21st century is basically defined by non-essential human beings who do not fit into the market as consumers, producers, or laborers. That manifests itself differently in different classes and geographic areas. For white, middle-class, male, useless people who have just enough family context to not be crushed by poverty, they become fail sons. Some of them turn into Nazis. Others become aware of the consequences of capitalism.
So there are two terms that they use here in describing their audience: fail sons, and then success daughters.
Right,
is what they call their female. They say 20 to 30% of their audience is made up of female fans who are success daughters. They are usually astrophysicists or novelists, and they're extremely on point and competent people.
Right. So it's basically just, look, what the problem is folks who are made useless, not whether they are a disenfranchised group, et cetera, et cetera. That it's just, here's the central economic structure problem, the base problem.
Right. I don't know if I agree with how they're positioning this, mostly because, again, like most of the show, it's pretty crass the way they're talking about diversity. But I do have a certain amount of sympathy for the idea that liberals, not leftists, tend to fall back on a sort of knee-jerk version of that's racist or that's sexist without actually thinking through the power relationships, especially those involved in capitalism, that have led to either women or people of color or what have you being oppressed within the hierarchies of capitalism.
Right. But there is, it's an ongoing argument whether that can be challenged by the occasional representation of different groups. That's sort of like this is trickle down diversity in a way, trickle down feminism, trickle down justice.
Yeah.
Or whether the whole thing has to be transformed in the face of the particular concerns of various demographic groups.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think what they're asking is they're saying, like, you need to think a little bit more critically than just saying, like, that's racist or because you guys are all white, you're therefore invalidated, right? They're saying you have to step back and think about the power structures that enable that kind of practice in the first place. And then this is where I don't know that I necessarily either understand or come around to their argument, this stuff about middle-class white people becoming non-essential human beings and the terminology of fail sons and success
and thus
daughters.
Being radicalized. Don't forget, that's the context there.
Yeah, that's outside of my ballpark. I'm not quite sure I get it. But I do, again, like with most of this show, like it resonates with me and I have a certain amount of sympathy for it.
Okay. So let's try and sum up the things that are happening in this podcast and in the listeners, right? It's a genuine, ironic podcast, right? They sincerely believe the stuff that they're talking about, but they will also do things like call themselves Chapo Trap House and call their patrons Gray Wolves, which I didn't know this until the research, is named after a nationalist group in Turkey. This is a very offensive thing, especially right now.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like, as you mean right now, you mean like in the last 2 weeks.
In this fucking moment in history, yes. Mm-hmm. But it was kind of bullshit beforehand.
Right. But the way they look at it, again, this is this like Dadaist thing, right? Like, everything's fair game and language is malleable.
Yes. Okay. You remember we talked about Amber Ali Frost and how she probably coined Dirtbag Left. She wrote in an essay for Current Affairs that vulgarity is not inherently subversive, but it can help tarnish the unearned prestige of the powerful, something that many Democrats as well as Republicans hunger to do. We can, she says, reclaim vulgarity from the Trumps of the world or find ourselves handicapped by civility.
Yeah, so this is like the noble savage argument of rhetoric, right? That like you by adhering to nobility and not descending into vulgarity, that you are somehow ceding the battle.
Right. Yeah. I think John Podhoretz of the Commentary Magazine podcast calls it unilaterally disarming yourself if you fail to use one of the tools that has been introduced into the discourse.
Right. Yeah. It's a tool that's in the toolbox. It's like trying to build a house without a hammer.
So back to The Guardian, who says, they define the Dirtbag Left as a coterie of underemployed and overly online millennials radicalized by the Iraq War and the 2008 financial crisis. There's like a straight line from that moment in time to Bernie Sanders' candidacy. And in that political campaign in 2016, there was this argument that we find in Chapo Trap House. Mm-hmm. Democrats are not left enough. You know, true change can only come from a left candidate, and all other changes, incrementalism is a betrayal of progressivism.
Yeah, this is all, I don't know, we're trying to sort of stay out of subjectivity here, but this is all interesting to me because, you know, like playing punk music in the late 90s, going into the early 2000s, like I was pretty familiar already with the argument that the left wasn't left enough.
Yeah.
Before 9/11, before the war in Iraq, but those moments really seem to have radicalized the generation maybe just below you and mine.
Yeah, and the way that I see it presented on Twitter and on, you know, quote unquote extremely online personages, I didn't realize how clearly Chapo Trap House articulated that particular argument, and that the language they use, both in these interviews and on the podcast, either informs or coined some of the phrases that you see in the internet sphere of this discourse.
I have to be honest, like friends of mine even on Twitter who I see sort of behaving like this, and I've always sort of been like, guys, I don't know what you're getting out of that, but I can't participate in it anymore. You know, I see like, oh, they must be sort of tangentially connected to this whole movement that grew out of social media and spawned this podcast and then fed back into it.
Yeah. And, you know, a lot of people have written about how the humor and vulgarity of Chapo Trap House is indicative of this attempt to undo a certain kind of status quo establishment, or a certain kind of establishment sort of a policing of the cultural dialogue.
Yeah, right. Matt says this about the dirtbag left as the term. He says, the dirtbag left is anyone who isn't afraid to lose their job by insulting careerist hacks or to offend the sensibilities of leftist language police, whose only goal is in sabotaging social solidarity in order to maintain their brand as arbiters of good taste and acceptable speech.
Yeah, and then Will comes in with, the dirtbag left is a nice way of describing a kind of scurrilous and funny approach to left-wing politics that is in marked contrast to the utterly humorless and bloodless path. That's the important part. That leads many people with liberal or leftist proclivities into the trap of living in constant fear of offending some group that you're not a part of, up to and including the ruling class.
It's interesting, you know, what we were saying earlier about these guys' backgrounds, right? Both of these guys. Like, Will is the guy who's like the son of two New York Times editors. I don't know what his parents are like, but like I would imagine that, again, like this is a conservative nightmare and that they have a very specific idea of what he and his parents are like. And yet here he is saying, like, you know, even your stereotype of what liberals are like is not what I want. They're too beholden to civility.
And notice the nod to political correctness and language. Colette Shade writes about Chapo Trap House and says, you know, in the view of the people who make the podcast and listen to it, American liberalism is a failed attempt to appropriate identitarian language and concerns in order to dodge structural questions about the redistribution of resources, the inequity of which, of course, disproportionately affects marginalized groups.
Yeah.
And just to restate that, you know, this is like, oh, liberals will make sure you don't say the N-word while also not supporting any attempt to transform the economics and laws that marginalize African Americans.
Again, this will be a bonus point on Jason Puckett's super context square of me referencing when I used to play punk music, which I've already done once this episode.
Yeah.
But I actually wrote an article in grad school that was analyzing the political rhetoric of a band called Anti-Flag. And Anti-Flag are extreme leftists. They're people who I knew back in the 90s, and so I felt comfortable writing this analysis. And essentially the analysis was like, they are using vulgarity on a level to try to pierce through the veil of civility and like nobility that you see in political discourse.
Right.
Now, I think a lot of people now, 10 years after I wrote that article, would say, yeah, Donald Trump's doing the same thing. I don't think they're the same thing at all. But Chapo is kind of participating in that same kind of punk, savage approach to rhetoric.
Yeah. Which brings some people, like Colette's editor, to say, these guys seem like huge bullies, right? So this vulgarity, this sort of this violent rhetoric, this actively dismissing civility, this attempt to confirm the genuineness of their desire to make the world a better place.
Mm-hmm.
They want to bring all of that in this kind of alternative media package.
Yeah.
It makes me think of magazines that I only read about, never read, that were published in the late 60s that were countercultural.
Oh, you mean like underground newspapers?
Yeah. The underground newspapers, but also just like the straight up, the humor magazines where like, I think it was Paul Krasner could write a fake article, some fake news, in which Lyndon Johnson actually had sex with the bullet holes in JFK's body.
Okay. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Right.
Which, of course, is horrible, obscene. but also had a purpose. You know, and it would be easy to say to someone, you can argue about whether that was polite or not, but that doesn't change the fact that, you know, Lyndon Johnson was put in a position of power when JFK was killed, and no one is sure at this moment how that happened. Yeah,
right. All good points. What we're arguing about here is the methodology, right? In discourse, we're not arguing about I don't know, the intention.
Yeah, or the desired world, right? Like, what is the end result of this action? What are you hoping will happen? Not what are you hoping will happen in the audience's response, but what are you hoping you're pushing? Right? Yeah. Because that's what they hope they're doing. They are hoping that they are making people feel more comfortable or more clear on the idea of revolutionary politics as opposed to incrementalist politics.
Jason Rode wrote a pretty long piece and interview about Chapo Trap House in Paste magazine, of all places, which, for the irony on that, go back and listen to our episode about what happened to Paste magazine. But he says, in all other realities, Chapo Trap House died after its second episode, but in our world, it has become an underground cult that is a hit for up-all-night weirdos, MMA aficionados, Twitter fetishists, and most of all, the irreverent left. To say that Chapo is a show that's in poor taste is to mistake it for clear thinking. Chapo is not depraved. It sees clearly. It is not deliberately offensive. It's just unapologetically honest, which explains the exhilaration people get while listening to it.
Is there anything in your life that feels that way to you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I keep coming back to music, but in a lot of ways, the music that I came up on, this was sort of the ethos around it, which was like, you know what, like anything goes, and we will do anything to get your attention just to try to get you to think for one fucking second. You've been listening to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How it's made and how it informs our everyday culture.
Our theme music is Human Factor by Mile Marker.
And right now you're listening to Drive Fast by 3 Chain Links.
Show notes and all our past episodes are available at supercontextpodcast.libsyn.com.
You can email the show at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com to tell us what you like, what you don't like, and to suggest topics for future shows.
And I'm available on Twitter as @Christian Sager.
And I'm there @Bennett Radio. 2 N's, 2 T's.